Okay. So if you're just joining, the very first tutorial gave my game plan, kind of my mapping out my idea of how I was going to approach the semester and why I'm trying to build this crazy volume object that's in front of you right now on the screen. And for my students that are new to 3D, this certainly probably see a little intimidating, or how do I put all these pieces together? But hopefully the idea of these primitive objects creating kind of a more complex thing makes sense. But we definitely need to take a step back and look at the very very beginnings of just creating these objects and the coordinate system and how to start approaching this. So I'm going to leave this one for now, and let's just actually go and create a new project. So I have a nice clean one here, right? So I have a work plane, and we'll have talked about these in class once you see this tutorial. And I'm not going to worry too much about the navigation. I'm going to assume that you are all clear with that. But I'm going to start by just creating a cube itself, right? I'm just going to click on it. And so you see that the cube is over here in the object manager, and it's placed here. It looks relatively centered, right? It's right here in the grid, and it is centered, right? So when I create one of these objects as a default, it comes in at the very center of the world, the origin of this space. And if I had the cube selected, we have its basic tab. We also have its coordinates. So it tells me in the XYZ, it's at 0, 0, 0. It has no rotation. The HPB, heading, pitch, and bank, right? And S is for scale. So the scale hasn't been changed at all. If I click on object, it as a default comes in as 200 centimeters by 200 centimeters by 200 centimeters. I can change that, if I want to. I could just dial in a number. I can also, in the default object mode, and I've got the move tool selected here, I can click on these little yellow handles. You can see they're just kind of hiding right there in the little axes, right? So I can shape these. I can make the cube rectangular or whatever, but I can't make it a sphere, right? It just has to be that. I'm going to go ahead and just put this back where it was, right, at 200 by 200. And I'm just going to use this cube as a very beginning object, right? So let's leave that one there. And let's go ahead and create another one. This time, let's just go ahead and just do something simple. Let's create a cylinder, okay? So it's a little hard to see in there because they came in very similar size, but hopefully you can see there's a little curvature. I have the cylinder is here, and if I actually grab one of the handles, right? So if I click on one of these, I can move it directly in this axis, and I can move it on this axis. Or the z-axis, right? Don't want to leave the z-axis out. They all can be used. But I'm going to put this back at 0, 0, 0. And what I want to do is cut a little hole or depression here in the front of my object. So I could rotate it, but the one thing about these primitives is they have a parameter. The primitives have a parameter of orientation, right? So right now it's pointing in the up direction, right? So this is X positive and then X negative. This is Z positive and Z negative. And this is Y positive. And if I go the other direction, Y negative. But what I really wanted to do is point Z negative. In this case, right, whatever one axis you want to use, depends on what you need, right, in this case. So I modified it so that it's pointing this direction. In fact, to make this a little bit easier, let's go up and hide the cube. So I can click on this little arrow, which will disable this cube from existing. And I also, these little buttons here, we haven't talked about this yet, but certainly you're going to hear it in class. These allow me to make objects visible or not visible one way or the other. So if I just click on these little dots, they just keep changing. So it's just like a toggle. If I just click on this once, I hide that. So let's just keep that hidden for a second. You can see that I have the cylinder facing in this direction. Is what I want. I also want to move it out. Now I can move it by just clicking on the axis and just moving it whatever, right? So as I moved it, let's go back here. So as I move it, you can see that it gives me feedback, right? 56.129 units or whatever. There's no right or wrong answer. I would suggest that you try being a little more intentional at first about exactly how many units you want to move something, right? So you just get used to placing things. So for example, the cube was 200 by 200 by 200. So that's at the center of the world, right? So it means it has 100 of its width on one side and 100 of its width on the other side. So maybe with the cylinder, if we just want to move it out, let's go ahead and just move it. Oops, go to the coordinate. Let's move it minus 100. And I'm going to turn the cube back on. Okay, so you can see that I have one kind of colliding with the other. They're just basically stuck into each other. Don't do this, but if I change my display to just kind of a lines mode, you can see that one object is just inside of the other, right? It hasn't cut a hole. They just are intersecting, independent of each other. Let's turn our shading back on. All right, so the whole idea is I want to use the cylinder to chop a hole in the cube in this instance here. So what we need to use is this volume builder. There's some fancy ways to set this up, but for now I'm just going to go ahead and create these where along the top we have some series of primitives and splines and these generators, these green generators that do cool things when you put things inside of it. So if I roll my cursor over, you can see it gives me a little bit of help and said, hey, the volume builder's right here. And if I click the left mouse button and hold, you can see I have a volume builder and a volume mesher. So let's go ahead and just start with the volume builder as the first one. And wow, it's amazing. I created the volume builder and nothing changed. That's because this generator needs stuff to work on. So we do that by putting these objects inside or make them children of this object, right? So I immediately got some kind of weird representation. I'm also going to put the cylinder in there, and I'm going to put the cylinder above it, right? And again, all I did was I held down the left mouse button, and I'm still holding it down, and I just click and drag. And you can see it's like I can parent it to the cube, or I can just put it right there at this little line, in between, which would be inside the volume builder. I can just drop it right on top of the volume builder, and it puts it in there. And I now have this Minecraft-like version of these. And don't change this, but I'll just show you what's going on here. Is there are just these blocks, these three-dimensional pixels, right? These voxels that are representing that. And the larger those are, the less definition. I can't imagine a reason why you would want to make them 50. The default is 10. So I get a decent representation of what that shape is. Let's just go make it 5 for now. And you can see it already is getting a little more shape to it. But it's still kind of weird. It doesn't kind of look like the other surfaces. And if I were to render it, and we'll talk about this in a minute, nothing's going to show up. There's no geometry, right? This is just like the idea of what geometry could become, but it's not geometry. All right, so if I go over to the volume builder and let's go ahead and create a volume mesher, right? And they try to give you these clever little ways of, oops, not that one. So we get the builder here, and then the mesher is like, hey, let's put points around the outside surface of whatever the builder is. So that's how we're going to construct a surface. So I'll just take the builder and I'll just drag it right into the mesher. Right? And now I get a surface, and if I do press render, there's no lights in my scene or whatever, but I immediately get a surface, and the rendering engine's like, okay, I understand all these little polygons on there, and I get this idea. All right, so I do have these two objects. They've now been kind of glued together. You can see, and not really in the most pleasing way, but they're glued together, right? So let's go over to the builder. I've clicked on it, and you can see already underneath the builder, the objects tab, we've looked at the voxel size, right? So if I made it 10, I would get a kind of rougher approximation of that. It does get a little bit smoother because in essence, it doesn't have as much resolution. If I make it 5, it gets a little more resolution. The edges, like where these transitions happen, they start to get a little sharper because it's always trying to blend between all these different voxels a little bit. So the more voxel, or the tighter I make it, I'll just put 1, you can see that I get a really tight blend because there's so many dense pixels, right, as it tries to blur this edge. So for now, I'm just going to turn this back. Let's just put it to 3. Right? So have a decent surface. It has a little bit of beveling. What should the right number be? It depends, and I'm going to give you some clues as we go along, or some suggestions, clues. I'm going to make it a treasure hunt for you to figure out. I'll give you some suggestions about what this would be, but the lower this goes, the finer, the denser the resolution, but the more computation. And so if you have complex objects, it might take a little bit longer. It might be a little more sluggish on the screen. So as you're making changes, it's not a bad idea to, 10 is just a starting point. I would say 5's not a bad place to be working a lot of the time. 1 is a pretty decent quality. I wouldn't go lower than that unless you show me some geometry you're working on and I tell you okay, go just a little bit, like 0.7 or something. But this is an exponential change as we keep moving this down. So we don't want to go too far. We'll make smoke come out of the machine. So I'm just going to set it to 3 centimeters. That's okay. And the other thing too is we still haven't taken care of the problem of address the issue that we want this to be a hole, right? We don't want this sticking out, or at least in this case, we want this to be a hole inside there. So I'm going to change the mode here from union to subtract, right? We could do intersect, right? And we would get the remainder of what's inside there, but that's not really what we're after. We want this more complex shape that we get inside of there, right? And so we have a hole. It has a couple of problems. One, it looks like it's melting, right? It looks like a stick of butter that we've cut kind of a crude hole in, and then it's starting to melt on those sides there. So we're going to deal with that in a second. The other thing that's happening is you can see these, this little stair stepping going on, right? So this is a very important part of this process is the cylinder as a default has so many segments, right? So how much, I'm going to turn the builder off, right? How many times, you can see them here, 1, 2, 3, 4. In fact, let's go up and turn the lines on, right? You can see these slices, right? So right now it has 16. So I'm just looking at the object. It has a radius. I left it at 50, right? I could say, hey, let's make it smaller, thinner, right? I'll leave it at 50. And then it also has so many segments along the height, which we really don't need to change in this instance. But the rotation segments, this is where you'll have to up these in this process, or make them lower, right? So if I want to make it really smooth, I could turn this up, and you can see I get 72 subdivisions. And if I turn on the builder now, this is a lot, right? Inside of there, that looks a lot smoother, right? I don't see those big stair steps. I still have this issue of this here looking a little melty. That's not quite working right. And keep in mind, sometimes on these segments, sometimes you want something low. Like maybe I want to just cut that, or maybe I intentionally want something that's like I want a pentagon shape, right? Or hexagon or octagon or whatever that might be. So the right answer for rotation segments is not necessarily, higher, right? Make more. And in other instances, you definitely don't want to have 72 or 96 segments. It would make it very difficult to model. But in this volume modeling structure, this is something you're going to want to do if you want to smooth out and have kind of a smooth edge or cut. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back to 72. What's the right answer? I don't know. 64 would be close. 48. It's getting a little blocky. I don't know. I'll just go with 72. So that's the first part. The last part of this, just so we can make a nice clean shape of this, is how do we get these edges to get a little cleaner? Well, the first thing that we could try is make this a little bit lower, right? We'll add more resolution to it, so we make this all the way to 1. There's so many voxels in here that we're getting to the point these are just tight, sharp. In fact, they're too sharp, right? These are just not realistic to have edges that are perfect. And this is still a little jagged, right? Looks like I cut it out of cardboard or something. And this is still, even with all the segments that are in there, is there's still a little bit of that faceting, that stair step. So let's just go back to 3 so you can see how this changes this. So anytime you're using one of these, I just say across the board until you know other ways to deal with it. I would suggest that you just create, this is called a signed field, distance field. So that's, you don't even need to know that, but just other than the fact that you want to put an SDF smooth, right? A smooth for one of these fields on top of that. And you can see we get a lot better resolution, but it also got a little, maybe a little too smooth, right? Unless maybe that's what you're going after, right? But I want an edge that has a little bevel on it, but it doesn't have too much. So within the smooth, just at this point, just remember, Dane says always use a smooth, always make sure that it's at the very top in this instance, and on the voxel distance, just make it 1. So it just has to do with how far the distance is in between these things and how it does the smoothing. So it's still doing some smoothing, but it maybe doesn't look as melted, I guess. And the other thing, the final, I'm going to go to maybe 2, maybe 1.5, right? So the more voxels that I put in there, it gets a little tighter, right? But then I'm putting the blend or the smooth on top of it. So I still get that edge. So I'll go all the way up to what I would recommend to be the very highest resolution you would go to here. And I get a nice clean shape. Let's go to the filter and turn off that work plane, right? So I get a nice clean shape. I have this hole inside of that. And again, the other thing too is this is all non-destructive. So I could come back and make this 400 units. Right, so I can make this wider, and let's go make the cylinder, I don't know, 150. Right, and I've created another new cut piece in here that's not bad. Let's take it back to, I don't know, 75. But let's, in the coordinate system, let's move it up 50 units. Right, so these pieces are just there. I can come back to it. I can make changes. I could rotate it, change it, whatever I want to, right? This is the real value. And I think it's a good way for you to learn and experiment with making these forms in 3D, right? So 17 and a half minutes, gotten a little long here. So I will end this here. So just remember, we're starting with primitives, right? Primitives have parameters, right? How wide is it, or what's the radius? What's its orientation? How many slices or segments does it need? Does it have? It's not that it needs. How many does it have? And how many do I need depending on what it is that I want to do? As I mentioned before, maybe you want to come back and say, I don't want it to be smooth. I want some kind of shape like that, which is cool. I mean, look at that. Isn't that awesome? And then we put this in the builder. There's a voxel size. The default is 10, which is not going to be enough unless you want to make a bar of soap with some indentation in it. And we can just experiment with where you go with that. But I think 1 is kind of a good final quality without going crazy resolution. And we changed the mode, right, for the primitive. And then we've also used SDF smooth. One thing to keep in mind is if we create new objects that we would put down into, I'll just put one right there and just say Z, and we'll put it there. And this one, we'll drop it down in the builder. So now it's glued to it. Whenever you drop them into the builder, it always wants to put the new object at the top. So you'll have to always just continue to remember to move these up and put the smooth at the very top. There will be times we want to change that later on, but we won't worry about that right now. The other part that we could do with something like this is, let's delete that. So let's take this cylinder, and let's say we want to make a cut, but then we also want to fill another piece back in there. So I'm just going to duplicate the cylinder. I held down the command key. I'll maybe demo that in the next one. And all right, so we'll put it underneath the smooth. I'm going to make this union, but this one, let's make that about 70. Right, so now it's like there's a cut inside of there, and this piece fits perfectly inside of it. Right, maybe I'll make it 65. Right, So lots of different ways to keep piling these pieces up together one way or the other. Okay. Oh my God, 20 minutes. I should stop right there. I'll be back in future tutorials.